Someone like you doesn't belong in first class, the flight attendant said, blocking the black man in a hoodie from his seat. Big mistake. He owned the airline. And what he did next cost her everything. I'm sorry, sir, but you need to move to the back of the plane, Brianna Holt said, her voice sharp and cold. She crossed her arms over her crisp blue uniform, her name tag glinting under the cabin lights. Trevor's eyebrows lifted. Excuse me? You heard me, Brianna repeated, louder this time. Several passengers in nearby seats turned to look. This is first class. Your seat is in economy. Trevor held up his boarding pass, pointing to the seat number printed clearly, 2A. First class. Window seat. He'd flown this route dozens of times. My ticket says. I don't care what your ticket says, Brianna interrupted, her lips pressed into a thin line. There's obviously been a mistake. Someone like you doesn't belong in first class. The words hung in the air like poison. Trevor felt his chest tighten. He'd heard those words before, different versions of them, whispered and shouted throughout his life. But never like this. Never so brazenly, in front of so many witnesses. Someone like me? Trevor's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Brianna's eyes flicked up and down, taking in his appearance with barely concealed disgust. Trevor wore jeans and a simple black hoodie, comfortable clothes for the 2-hour flight from Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport to Los Angeles. His sneakers were worn but clean. To anyone else, he looked like a regular traveler. To Brianna, he looked like someone who didn't belong. Yes, she said simply. Please move to your actual seat before I have to call security. An older white woman in seat 1C looked away quickly, pretending to be fascinated by the safety card in her seat pocket. A businessman across the aisle typed furiously on his phone, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Trevor stood perfectly still. His mind raced through a dozen responses, a dozen ways this could go. He thought about the meetings waiting for him in Los Angeles. He thought about the company he'd built from nothing. He thought about every time he'd been judged, dismissed, or disrespected because of the color of his skin. But mostly, he thought about the young black boy sitting 3 rows back in economy, watching this entire exchange with wide, frightened eyes. I'm not moving, Trevor said quietly. Brianna's face flushed red. Then I'm calling the captain. Please do, Trevor replied, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. Brianna turned sharply and marched toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. The cabin fell silent except for the nervous whispers of passengers who'd witnessed the confrontation. Trevor stood in the aisle, still holding his boarding pass, his mind already working through what would happen next. He pulled out his phone with steady hands and opened an app that most people on this plane didn't know existed. An app that gave him access to something far more powerful than a first-class seat. The little boy in economy was still watching him. Trevor caught his eye and gave him a small nod, a silent promise that this wasn't over. 2 minutes later, Brianna returned with Captain Mike Stevens, a gray-haired man with a weathered face and tired eyes. Behind them was Jacob Torres, the co-pilot, looking confused about why he'd been pulled from his pre-flight checks. What seems to be the problem here? Captain Stevens asked, glancing between Brianna and Trevor. This passenger is refusing to move to his assigned seat, Brianna said quickly, her voice sugary sweet now that her superior was present. He's disrupting the boarding process and making other passengers uncomfortable. My assigned seat is 2A, Trevor said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. First class. I paid for it. I'm sitting in it. Captain Stevens took the boarding pass and examined it carefully. His eyebrows knitted together. This ticket is valid for seat 2A, sir, he said to Trevor, then turned to Brianna with confusion in his eyes. What's the issue? Brianna's confident expression faltered. I just thought there must be a mistake. He doesn't look like. Doesn't look like what? Trevor asked, his voice cutting through her excuse like a knife. The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the passengers still boarding in the aisle behind them had stopped moving, sensing the tension crackling through the air. Brianna's mouth opened and closed. Her face was turning a deeper shade of red. I just meant. I've never seen. It's unusual for a black man to afford first class? Trevor finished for her, his words clear and deliberate. Captain Stevens' expression hardened. Ms. Holt, this passenger has a valid ticket. Please return to your duties. But Brianna wasn't ready to back down. Years of unchecked prejudice and assumption had made her bold. Captain, I really think we should verify his payment method. These tickets can be fraudulent. I've read about it. People steal credit cards and... My payment method? Trevor's laugh was short and bitter. He looked at the captain, then back at Brianna. You want to verify my payment method? It's just standard procedure, Brianna insisted, though everyone in the cabin knew that was a lie. She'd never asked to verify anyone else's ticket. Not the white businessman in 3B. Not the elderly woman in 1C. Just Trevor. Trevor's finger hovered over his phone screen. One tap. That's all it would take. You know what, Trevor said slowly, his eyes locked on Brianna's, I think we need to have a bigger conversation about your standard procedures. He pressed the button. Within seconds, Captain Stevens' phone buzzed. Then the co-pilot's phone. Then every crew member's device lit up simultaneously with an emergency alert. Captain Stevens pulled out his phone, his face going pale as he read the message on his screen. His eyes widened. He looked up at Trevor, then back at his phone, then at Trevor again. Sir, I need to. The captain stammered, something he clearly never did. What is it? Brianna demanded, annoyed that the attention had shifted away from her target. Captain Stevens ignored her. He was staring at Trevor like he'd just seen a ghost. Is your name Trevor Hamilton? It is, Trevor confirmed. As in, Trevor Hamilton of HorizonWing Airlines. The cabin erupted in gasps and whispers. Brianna's face went from red to white in an instant. What? Trevor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's right, Ms. Holt. I'm Trevor Hamilton. And you just discriminated against me on one of my own planes. His fingers moved across his phone screen with practiced ease, pulling up another screen that made Captain Stevens' blood run cold. As CEO of HorizonWing Airlines, Trevor continued, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin, I'm officially grounding this flight until we can have a thorough discussion about discrimination training and company policies. Brianna stumbled backward, gripping the nearest seat for support. No, that's not. I didn't know. Would it have mattered if you knew? Trevor asked, his question hanging in the air like an accusation. The answer was written all over Brianna's horrified face. Captain Stevens was already on his radio, his voice shaky as he contacted the control tower. Phoenix Sky Harbor, this is Flight 427. We have a situation. The CEO of HorizonWing Airlines is on board and has ordered the flight grounded. We need guidance. Repeat, we are not departing. Through the windows, Trevor could see ground crew members rushing toward the plane, their faces confused. In the terminal, travelers pressed against the glass, trying to understand why the plane that was supposed to take off in 10 minutes was suddenly surrounded by emergency vehicles. Trevor turned to address the entire first-class cabin, his voice strong and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. But I think it's time we had a conversation about respect, dignity, and what really matters when we travel together. Brianna Holt stood frozen in the aisle, her world crumbling around her, realizing that her split-second judgment had just destroyed her career. But the worst was yet to come. What would happen next? Would Brianna lose her job? Would the other passengers speak up? And what about that young boy in economy who'd watched everything unfold? If you think discrimination has no place in the skies, or anywhere else, then you need to hear the rest of this story. Anyone who scrolls away now is basically saying this treatment is okay. Don't be that person. The next chapter reveals what Trevor does with his power, and whether justice actually gets served. Stay if you believe actions have consequences. The moments after Trevor's revelation felt like they lasted forever. Brianna Holt's legs finally gave out, and she sank into the nearest empty seat. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. Around her, passengers pulled out their phones, already posting about what they'd just witnessed. The hashtags were writing themselves. Trevor remained standing in the aisle, his phone still in his hand, watching as his entire airline scrambled to respond to his order. He could see the confusion spreading like wildfire, gate agents running toward the jetway, security personnel gathering near the entrance, and through the cockpit door, he heard Captain Stevens speaking in rapid, urgent tones with the control tower. Sir, Captain Stevens said, emerging from the cockpit with sweat beading on his forehead. The tower is asking for confirmation. You're really grounding the entire flight? I am, Trevor said firmly. And I want every passenger compensated for the delay. Full refunds, plus travel vouchers. A businessman in seat 3B stood up, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. I have a meeting in Los Angeles in 3 hours. You can't just ground a whole flight because of one employee's mistake. Trevor turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. One employee's mistake, he repeated slowly. Is that what you'd call it if someone refused to let you sit in the seat you paid for because of the color of your skin? The businessman's mouth snapped shut. He looked around for support, but every other passenger had suddenly found their phones or magazines incredibly interesting. That's what I thought, Trevor said quietly. The elderly woman in seat 1C finally spoke up, her voice trembling. I saw everything. She was wrong. Completely wrong. She looked at Brianna with disappointment. I've flown for 40 years, and I've never seen a flight attendant treat anyone like that. Other passengers began nodding and murmuring in agreement. The woman in 4A raised her hand like she was in a classroom. I recorded some of it on my phone. If you need evidence, I mean. Trevor nodded gratefully. Thank you. I may take you up on that. Brianna finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. Mr. Hamilton, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Please, I have 2 kids at home. I can't lose this job. I didn't mean. You didn't mean what? Trevor interrupted, his voice harder now. You didn't mean to judge me based on my appearance? You didn't mean to assume a black man couldn't afford first class? You didn't mean to threaten me with security? Each question hit Brianna like a physical blow. Tears started streaming down her face, her makeup running in dark streaks. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. Trevor studied her for a long moment. He thought about all the times he'd heard those words. Sorry. People were always sorry after they got caught. Sorry after their prejudice was exposed. Sorry when there were consequences. But were they ever sorry before? Ms. Holt, Trevor said, his voice softer but no less serious, I'm going to tell you something my grandmother told me when I was 10 years old. She said, Trevor, baby, sorry doesn't rebuild what hate tears down. Do you understand what that means? Brianna shook her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. It means that your apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the humiliation. It doesn't erase the message you sent to every person of color on this plane that they don't belong in spaces you think are too good for them. He paused, then gestured toward the back of the plane. There's a 12-year-old boy sitting back there who watched you try to kick me out of my seat. What did you teach him today? That no matter how hard he works, no matter what he achieves, someone will always try to put him in his place? The cabin was so quiet that Trevor could hear Brianna's ragged breathing. Even the businessman who'd complained earlier had his head down, looking ashamed. Captain Stevens cleared his throat. Mr. Hamilton, the airport director is on her way. She wants to speak with you personally. And, headquarters is calling every 30 seconds. Trevor nodded. Tell them I'll speak with everyone shortly. But first, I need to address the passengers. He moved to the front of the first-class cabin where everyone could see him. Some passengers were still boarding from economy, crowding into the aisle to hear what the CEO of the airline had to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Trevor began, his voice carrying through the plane, I know this isn't how anyone expected their flight to start today. You're probably wondering why I grounded this flight instead of just dealing with this situation quietly. He paused, making eye contact with several passengers. The truth is, I could have pulled Ms. Holt aside. I could have handled this behind closed doors. I could have taken my seat and filed a complaint later that would probably go nowhere. That's what usually happens, isn't it? Several passengers nodded, including a young black woman in economy who had tears in her eyes. But I'm tired, Trevor continued, his voice growing stronger. I'm tired of quiet discrimination. I'm tired of people making assumptions about who belongs where. And I'm especially tired of companies that preach diversity and inclusion in their advertisements but don't enforce it with their employees. He looked directly at Brianna, who was still crying in her seat. Ms. Holt, you're suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. You'll receive your full pay during the investigation because I believe in fair process, even when others don't. Brianna's head shot up, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. But understand this, Trevor continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. If the investigation confirms what we all witnessed today, and I believe it will, your employment with HorizonWing Airlines will be terminated. Not because of one mistake, but because that mistake revealed a mindset that has no place in my company. The hope in Brianna's eyes died. She buried her face in her hands. Trevor turned back to the passengers. My assistant will be contacting each of you for statements. Your honesty will help ensure this never happens again. What about our flights? Someone called from economy. Are we really stuck here? Trevor allowed himself a small smile. You'll all be accommodated on the next available HorizonWing flights, with the compensation I mentioned earlier. Or, if you prefer, we can get this flight back in the air within the hour, with a new lead flight attendant. Captain Stevens looked shocked. Within the hour? Sir, the paperwork alone. I'm the CEO, Captain, Trevor reminded him gently. I think I can cut through some red tape. A ripple of relieved laughter spread through the cabin. The tension was finally starting to break. But then Trevor's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed. The number was from HorizonWing's board of directors. All 12 members on a conference call. This was going to get complicated. Excuse me, Trevor said to the passengers. I need to take this call. He stepped into the jetway, leaving behind a plane full of people who were frantically texting, posting, and calling everyone they knew about what they'd just witnessed. Inside the cabin, Brianna Holt sat alone in her shame, realizing that her entire life had just changed because she'd made one terrible assumption about a man in a hoodie. The businessman in 3B leaned across the aisle to his neighbor and whispered, "Did you see his face when he answered that phone? Something bigger is happening here." He was right. Subscribe if you believe people should face real consequences for discrimination. Only someone who's okay with racism would skip this. The next chapter shows whether Trevor's own board turns against him for grounding a profitable flight, and whether corporate greed wins over doing what's right. Trevor stood in the jetway, the phone pressed against his ear, and braced himself for what was coming. "Trevor, what the hell is going on?" The voice belonged to Richard Pemberton, the chairman of HorizonWing's board of directors. His tone was sharp, impatient, and completely lacking in sympathy. "Good morning, Richard," Trevor said calmly. "I assume you've heard about the incident on Flight 427. Incident?" Richard's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Trevor, you've grounded a fully booked flight during peak travel season. Do you have any idea how much money we're losing every minute that plane sits on the ground? We're talking thousands of dollars." Trevor watched through the jetway window as news crews began setting up cameras near the gate. Word was spreading fast. "I'm aware of the costs, Richard. I'm also aware that we just had a flight attendant racially profile a passenger, who happened to be me, in front of 50 witnesses." There was a pause on the other end. Trevor could hear muffled voices as Richard consulted with the other board members. "Put me on speaker," Trevor said. "I know they're all there." A click, and suddenly Trevor could hear the background noise of the boardroom, papers shuffling, nervous coughs, whispered conversations. "Mr. Hamilton," a woman's voice cut through the noise. "Sandra Chen, the board's vice chair and the only person who ever called him by his last name. We understand that you had an unpleasant experience. We truly do. But grounding an entire flight? Compensating every passenger? This is going to cost the company over $100,000, not counting the PR nightmare we're about to face." "PR nightmare?" Trevor repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sandra, the PR nightmare would be doing nothing. Can you imagine the headlines if people found out that HorizonWing's CEO was discriminated against on his own airline, and he just let it slide?" "That's exactly my point," Sandra shot back. "The CEO was discriminated against. You have the power to handle this internally, quietly. Fire the employee, send out a memo about sensitivity training, and move on. But this? This is a spectacle. It makes the company look chaotic and unstable." Trevor closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He'd known this conversation was coming. The board had always been more concerned with profit margins than principles. That's why he'd fought so hard to maintain majority control of the company when it went public 3 years ago. "Let me be very clear," Trevor said, opening his eyes. "This isn't about one employee. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. How many other passengers have been treated this way by our staff? How many complaints have been swept under the rug because dealing with them was too expensive or too complicated?" "Trevor, you're being emotional," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I understand you're upset, but you need to think like a businessman here, not like a..." "Not like a what, Richard?" Trevor interrupted. "Finish that sentence." The silence on the other end was deafening. "That's what I thought," Trevor said coldly. "Here's what's going to happen. Flight 427 stays grounded until we've completed a preliminary investigation. The flight attendant remains suspended. Every passenger gets compensated. And we're launching a company-wide review of all discrimination complaints from the past 5 years." "That's insane," another voice erupted. James Walsh, the oldest member of the board and a notorious penny pincher. "Do you know how many complaints we receive? Hundreds. Maybe thousands. We can't review them all, it would take months and cost a fortune." "Then we'll take months," Trevor replied. "And we'll spend the money. Because if we've been ignoring legitimate complaints about discrimination, then we deserve every dollar it costs to fix it." He could hear arguing on the other end, multiple voices talking over each other, some angry, some worried. Trevor waited, letting them exhaust themselves. Finally, Richard's voice cut through the chaos. "Trevor, the board is going to call for a vote. We want you to reverse this decision. Get that plane in the air, handle the employee situation privately, and let's move forward." Trevor's grip tightened on his phone. "And if I refuse? Then we'll have to consider whether your judgment is compromised," Sandra said carefully. "Whether you're still the right person to lead this company." There it was. The threat he'd been expecting. They were going to try to remove him as CEO. "You don't have the votes," Trevor said simply. "I own 51% of this company. You can't touch me." Actually, Richard said, and Trevor heard the smugness in his voice, we've been reviewing the company bylaws. There's a clause, Section 7.3, that allows the board to temporarily suspend a CEO's authority if his actions pose an immediate financial threat to the company. We'd need a 2/3 vote, which we have. Trevor's blood ran cold. He'd written those bylaws himself, years ago, as a protection against hostile takeovers. He never imagined they'd be used against him. You're bluffing, Trevor said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Try us, Sandra replied. Reverse your decision in the next 30 minutes, or we vote. And Trevor? We will win. The line went dead. Trevor stood alone in the jetway, staring at his phone. Behind him, through the door to the plane, he could hear the passengers talking, waiting to see what would happen next. Ahead of him, through the terminal windows, he could see the news cameras multiplying. He thought about his grandmother, who'd raised him after his parents died. She'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, cleaning offices at night so he could have a better life than she'd had. She'd taught him that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always profitable. But it was always worth it. Trevor pulled up his contacts and made a call. Jennifer? It's Trevor. I need you to draft a press release. We're going to war with our own board. Through the jetway window, he saw Airport Director Maria Gonzalez hurrying toward the gate, flanked by 2 security officers and what looked like HorizonWing's regional manager. The situation was about to get a whole lot worse. But Trevor Hamilton had built an airline from nothing. He'd overcome poverty, racism, and 100 people telling him he couldn't succeed. He wasn't about to back down now. Hit that like button if you think standing up for what's right matters more than money. Anyone who scrolls past is basically saying discrimination is fine as long as it's profitable. Don't be that person. Chapter 4 reveals whether Trevor loses everything he's built, or whether courage actually pays off. Maria Gonzalez burst through the gate door with the force of someone who'd had enough of drama for one day. She was a short woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried herself like someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with every kind of airport crisis imaginable. Mr. Hamilton, she said, slightly out of breath. I'm Maria Gonzalez, airport director. We need to talk. Trevor pocketed his phone and extended his hand. Ms. Gonzalez. I appreciate you coming personally. She shook his hand firmly, then gestured to the 2 men beside her. This is David Park, your regional manager, and Marcus. She stopped, catching herself. Sorry, Officer James Riley from Airport Security. We need to understand what's happening here before this situation gets any more out of control. David Park looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. As regional manager, he was technically Trevor's employee, but he clearly hadn't expected to deal with his CEO today. Mr. Hamilton, sir, I just want to say that whatever happened, we'll handle it according to company policy. Company policy is part of the problem, Trevor interrupted. David, how many discrimination complaints have you received in the Phoenix region in the past year? David's face went pale. I'd have to check the exact numbers. Estimate. Maybe 20? 25? And how many resulted in employee terminations? David shifted uncomfortably. 2. But sir, most complaints don't rise to that level. We do counseling, additional training. So we teach people not to be racist instead of removing them from positions where they can hurt people. Trevor asked. That's what we're calling handling it? Maria cleared her throat. Mr. Hamilton, I understand you're upset. But right now, you have a plane full of passengers, news crews gathering outside, and according to my staff, your own board is threatening to remove you. We need a solution that works for everyone. There is no solution that works for everyone, Trevor said firmly. Either we take a stand against discrimination, or we don't. There's no middle ground here. Officer Riley spoke up for the first time. Sir, with all due respect, I've worked airport security for 15 years. I've seen situations like this escalate fast. You've got passengers posting videos online. In about 10 minutes, you're going to have protesters, counter-protesters, and media everywhere. Is that really what you want? Trevor looked at the young officer. He couldn't have been more than 30, with kind eyes that suggested he actually cared about his job. Officer Riley, let me ask you something. If you saw someone being treated unfairly because of their race, would you speak up? Even if it was complicated? Even if it cost you something? Riley hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'd like to think I would, yes. Then you understand why I can't back down, Trevor said simply. Through the gate window, Trevor could see passengers on the plane craning their necks, trying to figure out what was happening. He could see Brianna Holt still sitting in that first-class seat, her face buried in her hands. And he could see that 12-year-old boy from economy, now standing in the aisle, watching everything with wide, hopeful eyes. That boy was why this mattered. Maria's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. Mr. Hamilton, I'm getting word that your board is holding an emergency vote right now. They're actually trying to suspend your authority as CEO. David Park gasped. They can't do that. Can they? They're trying, Trevor said grimly. He pulled out his own phone and saw 17 missed calls from Jennifer, his assistant, and a text message that made his stomach drop, board vote in progress. They have the votes. I'm so sorry. For the first time since this whole thing started, Trevor felt genuinely afraid. He'd built HorizonWing from nothing, started with one small regional route and turned it into a national airline. It was his life's work, his legacy, his grandmother's dream come to life. And he was about to lose it because he refused to let discrimination slide. Sir? David said quietly. What are you going to do? Trevor looked at the phone in his hand. He could call Richard right now. He could apologize, reverse his decision, get the plane in the air, and keep his job. The board would back down. He'd still be CEO. Life would go on. But that 12-year-old boy would learn that money and power mattered more than dignity. That even the CEO of an airline couldn't fight discrimination without losing everything. That sometimes, keeping your head down was the only way to survive. Trevor thought about his grandmother again. She'd told him once, near the end of her life, that she'd never regretted standing up for what was right, even when it cost her. Baby, she'd said, you can lose money. You can lose jobs. But if you lose yourself? That's something you never get back. Trevor made his decision. He turned to Maria, David, and Officer Riley. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk onto that plane and address those passengers one more time. Then I'm going to hold a press conference right here in the terminal. And I'm going to tell everyone exactly what happened today and exactly what I'm doing about it. Even if it costs you the company? Maria asked softly. Especially if it costs me the company, Trevor replied. Because if I can't run an airline that treats people with dignity, then I don't deserve to run an airline at all. David looked like he might cry. Sir, that's really brave. No, Trevor corrected him. It's really basic. It's the bare minimum of human decency. The fact that it seems brave is exactly why we have a problem. He started walking toward the plane door, then stopped and turned back. Officer Riley, I'm going to need you to do me a favor. What's that, sir? When those news crews ask you what happened here today, tell them the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make me look bad. Especially the parts that make the airline look bad. Can you do that? Riley straightened up, looking like Trevor had just asked him to do something important. Yes, sir. I can do that. Trevor nodded and walked back onto the plane. Every passenger looked up as he entered. The cabin was silent except for the hum of the auxiliary power unit. Trevor could feel 50 pairs of eyes on him, waiting to see what the CEO who'd grounded his own flight would do next. He took a deep breath and prepared to lose everything. Subscribe right now if you believe some things are worth fighting for, even when you have everything to lose. Only cowards and bullies would scroll past this moment. Chapter 5 is the finale, where we find out if Trevor's courage changes anything, or if the system just crushes another person who dared to stand up. Trevor stood at the front of the first-class cabin, looking at the sea of faces staring back at him. Some were curious, some were anxious, and some, like the 12-year-old boy now standing in the aisle between economy and first class, were filled with something that looked like hope. Ladies and gentlemen, Trevor began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. In about 5 minutes, I might not be the CEO of this airline anymore. My board of directors is voting right now to suspend my authority because I refuse to sweep this incident under the rug. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 3B who'd complained earlier looked genuinely shocked. They can't do that, he muttered. They can, Trevor said. And they probably will. But before that happens, I want to tell you why I made the choice I did. He gestured toward Brianna, who was still crying quietly in her seat. Several passengers had moved away from her, leaving her isolated in her shame. Ms. Holt made a terrible decision today. She judged me based on my appearance and decided I didn't belong in first class. But here's the thing, she didn't wake up this morning planning to be racist. She probably doesn't even think she is racist. Brianna looked up, her face streaked with tears and mascara, her expression a mixture of shame and desperate gratitude that someone was trying to explain her. But that's exactly the problem, Trevor continued, his voice growing stronger. Discrimination doesn't always come with a hood and a burning cross. Sometimes it comes with a smile and standard procedures. Sometimes it's just someone making assumptions about who belongs where based on the color of their skin. He turned to address the entire plane. Every single person on this aircraft has made assumptions about someone at some point. We all have. But the difference is whether we recognize it, whether we challenge ourselves, and whether we're willing to change. The elderly woman in 1C raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Hamilton, what's going to happen to her? To Brianna? Trevor looked at Brianna for a long moment. That depends on the investigation. But I'll be honest with you all, my instinct says she'll be terminated. Not because I want revenge, but because our passengers deserve to fly without wondering if they'll be judged, questioned, or humiliated based on how they look. Brianna let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. But, Trevor continued, and Brianna's head jerked up, I'm also going to make sure she gets access to proper counseling and education about unconscious bias. And if she truly learns from this, truly changes, then maybe someday she can work in this industry again. Just not with my airline, and not until she's proven she understands the weight of what she did. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Trevor ignored it. Whatever the board had decided, he'd find out soon enough. There's a young man on this plane, Trevor said, his eyes finding the 12-year-old boy in the aisle. Son, what's your name? The boy's eyes went wide. Me? Yes, you. It's Malik, sir, the boy said quietly. Malik, Trevor repeated, walking down the aisle toward him. I saw you watching earlier when Ms. Holt tried to kick me out of my seat. What were you thinking? Malik glanced at his mother, a tired-looking woman in a nurse's uniform sitting beside him. She nodded encouragingly. I was thinking. Malik hesitated, then found his courage. I was thinking that even when you're successful, people still won't treat you right. My mom always tells me to work hard and follow my dreams, but I was wondering if it even matters. The cabin was completely silent. Even Brianna had stopped crying to listen. Trevor knelt down in the aisle so he was eye level with Malik. It matters, Malik. It matters more than you can possibly know. Yes, you'll face people who judge you unfairly. Yes, there will be times when it feels like the whole world is against you. But you know what? What? Malik asked, his voice barely a whisper. Every single time someone tries to put you in a box, you get to prove them wrong. Every single time someone says you don't belong somewhere, you get to show them exactly why you do. And someday, when you're successful, and you'll have the power to make sure other kids like you don't have to face the same battles. Malik's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling. Really? Really, Trevor promised. That's why I couldn't just let this go. Because you were watching. Because somewhere out there, thousands of kids like you are going to hear about what happened today. And they need to know that standing up for yourself isn't just allowed, it's required. Trevor's phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. He stood up and pulled it out. There was a text from Jennifer, call me now. Emergency. Excuse me, Trevor said to the passengers. He stepped back toward the front of the cabin and dialed Jennifer. She answered on the first ring. Trevor, the board voted. But, I know, Trevor said calmly. It's okay, Jennifer. We knew this might. No, Trevor, listen, Jennifer interrupted, her voice breathless with excitement. The vote failed. Richard tried to suspend you, but 3 board members voted against it. They didn't have the 2/3 majority they needed. Trevor's heart nearly stopped. What? Sandra Chen and James Walsh both switched their votes at the last second, Jennifer explained rapidly. Apparently, the videos from passengers started going viral while they were voting. The hashtag #StandWithTrevor is trending nationwide. They got scared of the backlash. Trevor leaned against the bulkhead, barely able to process what he was hearing. So I'm still CEO? You're still CEO, Jennifer confirmed. And Trevor? Richard Pemberton just resigned from the board. He said if the company was going to prioritize political correctness over profits, he didn't want to be part of it. Trevor couldn't help it, he laughed. It was a sound of pure relief mixed with disbelief. Good riddance. There's more, Jennifer said. We're getting calls from major news networks, civil rights organizations, and even other airlines asking about our diversity policies. This is huge, Trevor. You turned a crisis into a movement. Trevor looked out at the passengers, who were watching him with curious expressions, trying to figure out what was happening. His eyes found Malik again, still standing in the aisle with hope written all over his face. Jennifer, draft another press release, Trevor said. Tell them that HorizonWing Airlines is launching a complete overhaul of our discrimination policies. Mandatory bias training for all employees, not just the ones who get caught. A zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. And a dedicated hotline for passengers to report incidents without fear of retaliation. That's going to cost millions, Jennifer warned. I don't care, Trevor said firmly. Also, set up a scholarship fund. The Trevor Hamilton Scholarship for young people pursuing careers in aviation. I want kids like Malik to know they have a place in this industry. He could hear Jennifer typing furiously. Done. Anything else? Yes, Trevor said, looking at Brianna one last time. Make sure Ms. Holt gets a fair investigation. I meant what I said about counseling and education. We're not just punishing people, we're trying to change the culture. Understood, Jennifer said. Oh, and Trevor? The Phoenix news stations are set up outside. They want a statement. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, Trevor said. Right after I do something important. He ended the call and walked back to where Malik stood with his mother. Malik, Trevor said, pulling a business card from his wallet, I want you to have this. When you're ready to start your career, whether that's in aviation or anything else, you call this number. I'm going to personally make sure you have every opportunity to succeed. Malik took the card with trembling hands. His mother started crying, covering her mouth with her hand. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Trevor straightened up and addressed the entire cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay, but this flight will be departing shortly with a new lead flight attendant. Your compensation will be processed within 24 hours. And thank you, all of you, for being witnesses today. You didn't stay silent, and that matters more than you know. The cabin erupted in applause. Even the businessman in 3B was clapping, looking somewhat ashamed of his earlier complaints. Trevor walked off the plane, through the jetway, and into the terminal where news cameras were waiting. Behind him, he could hear Captain Stevens making an announcement about the flight's new departure time. As Trevor approached the cameras, he saw Officer Riley standing nearby, ready to tell the truth just as he'd promised. Maria Gonzalez was there too, along with David Park, who looked like he'd just witnessed something that would change how he did his job forever. Trevor took a breath and stepped up to the microphones. Good afternoon, he said. My name is Trevor Hamilton, CEO of HorizonWing Airlines. Today, I was racially profiled on one of my own flights. And I'm here to tell you exactly what we're going to do about it. The cameras flashed. The reporters leaned in. And somewhere on Flight 427, now preparing for takeoff with a new crew member, Malik pressed his face against the window and smiled. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come quickly. It didn't always come easily. But when people were brave enough to demand it, when they were willing to risk everything for what was right, it did come. And that made all the difference. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because staying silent helps the Briannas of the world keep their power. Share this if you believe change happens when good people refuse to back down. And remember, every time you scroll past injustice without speaking up, you're choosing a side. Choose wisely.